We're going to start today with an incredible story in outer space and then come right back down to Earth with updates on your biggest headlines of the week. I'm Jenna, and this is Smarter News. Well, Tuesday, we watched another American astronaut launch to the International Space Station. His name, Johnny Kim. His background, slightly unusual. Johnny first decided to enlist in the Navy as a young man, eventually becoming a Navy SEAL. Later, he attended Harvard Medical School and became a doctor. And then he thought, you know what? Why not NASA? And now he's an astronaut. In between all of that, he got married to his amazing wife, Hetty, and they have three beautiful children. He's 41 years old, and he's going to spend the next 8 months or so in space. A Navy SEAL, a doctor, and an astronaut. So just a reminder of what's possible, not to make us all feel a little inadequate. I know that resume can do that. It's very impressive. And that's an understatement, isn't it? But Johnny is incredibly warm. You'd feel instantly at home with him. And I say that because he happens to be a friend of our family. And fun fact, my husband was actually in Kazakhstan to watch Johnny, his former SEAL teammate, fulfill his dream.
NASA's Johnny Kim arriving on the International Space Station.
Why do we continue to use Baikonur in Kazakhstan to launch? Baikonur is the place where this happens, and it used to be part of the Soviet Union. It's been used for decades. Now Russia leases this launch site, which has been described as the world's largest operational space launch facility. And for a while, it was the only place anyone could launch to space, especially after NASA shuttered its space program back in 2011. It's a really interesting partnership we have with the Russians, despite, again, everything that's going on, the politics here on Earth. Space diplomacy is a real thing. And there's a question, of course, about how some of this may change with partnerships that NASA now has with SpaceX, for example, but it's still very fascinating and a reminder of all the amazing things that can happen in the world and the amazing people that we get to learn about, even while our headlines can reflect a lot of heavy issues and potentially some stressful events. And I know that it potentially feels that way this week. So let me just update you on a few of the big stories we have in front of us so you have what you need. First things first, let's talk about tariffs. So Wednesday is a big day to watch because at midnight Wednesday, the new discounted reciprocal tariffs go into place. The president has mentioned over the last several days, along with members of his administration, some negotiations that are happening with other countries. And he also mentioned, we're not necessarily negotiating, he says, just about tariffs. It can also be about regulation and this idea of opening markets to American companies. One of the things to watch now is that these tariffs and the anticipation of them were really concepts, and they're moving from concepts to real life. And this is where we'll start seeing some adjustments being made. We don't really know what that's going to look like. You should not expect a light switch moment where the rug gets pulled out from underneath you when it comes to certain pricing, but it is sort of difficult to anticipate exactly what changes could be made by companies. And this marks a point, a point of before and after, a demarcation point where we could potentially start seeing changes over the next several weeks or months as businesses and governments adjust. In the meantime, a bipartisan group of lawmakers have floated a bill that would potentially curb some of the presidential power when it comes to tariffs. I talked a little bit about this on Scoop on Monday, but it's worth just noting this and putting it back on your radar. Congress has passed legislation 3 times, in fact, in the last 100 years, all 3 separate bills that have given the executive branch more power when it comes to tariffs, more unilateral power. So this new legislation would not take away those old laws, but it would potentially give Congress the ability to review tariffs. Now, there's a lot of what ifs here. Does Congress have the vote to even pass this? If it gets to the president's desk, would the president sign this into law? Would Congress then potentially have the votes to overturn a veto by the president? The president didn't like this legislation. So a lot of what ifs here, but notable that you see both Republicans and Democrats looking at the current system and wondering, is this the right way for this to work, with the president being able to issue sweeping tariffs without the check of Congress? So a story to watch. Separately, Speaker Johnson got into the mix, not just about tariffs. He certainly has talked about that, but about fluoride. Yes, fluoride. And here's a little bit of context. I wanted to mention this story because it really affects all of us. If we're using any water out of the faucet, it affects us. We started putting fluoride in our drinking water in America back in the 1940s, 1950s to help prevent tooth decay. Just last month, Utah became the first state to ban fluoride in public drinking water. And there's a reason for that. There's been some questions recently about the side effects of this, of having fluoride in our water, and also a question about whether or not we need some more updated research on this particular topic. Secretary Kennedy, the Secretary of Health and Human Services, was in Utah on Monday. He was talking a little bit about this. So this bumped this story up back on our radar. And he says he's going to arrange a task force to investigate the CDC recommendations on this particular topic. The EPA says something similar. And on Tuesday, Speaker Johnson voiced his support about this as well.
Yeah, it's an interesting issue. I don't profess to be an expert in chemistry. I do constitutional law primarily, but I'll tell you that I think it deserves, from what I've read and from what I understand, it deserves real evaluation. There's a concern that it may be having a negative effect on the health of children, and obviously we have an obligation at the federal government level to look into that. So I'm as interested as you are. I don't have the answers, but I think it's one that the question has been begged and it needs to be addressed. So.
One thing to note, the federal government cannot force states to make changes when it comes to something like fluoride, but the CDC can change recommendations and the EPA can change regulations. So we'll watch this space. Again, we all kind of share in this. And it's a good reminder we should all brush our teeth. No, I mean, with clean water, with any water that you want, but brushing your teeth is still a really good idea. I'm just going to put that out there. All right. This is a big story we've talked a lot about in recent weeks. It's been highly debated. And now the Supreme Court was taking a closer look at this. So at the beginning of the week, the Supreme Court issued a key decision, albeit that a decision on this issue related to immigration and border security does not put this issue to bed. We're going to hear more about these issues, but it's a development. So in order to talk about what the Supreme Court did, let's talk a little bit about the Alien Enemies Act. This is the law from 1798 that the White House has used to justify removing alleged gang members, Venezuelan gang members, from the United States and sending them to El Salvador. The background on this, so when this happened, when the administration first did this, there was a case that was brought on behalf of some of these individuals that were removed. And a lower federal court issued a pause on these removals. The administration obviously didn't want to pause. And now this issue is before the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court took an emergency look at this and in a split decision ruled in favor of the administration being able to use this law to continue its work more or less. But this is really important. The Supreme Court did not rule on the merits of the law. They did not rule in favor of the constitutionality of using this law forever and ever in this way in modern times. What the Supreme Court said is that the defendants that are challenging the use of this law by the current administration should have filed this lawsuit in a different court. They should have filed it in Texas because that's where some of these individuals are being held, not in Washington, D.C., not in a Washington, D.C. court where the judge issued the temporary pause. And there's been some back and forth between this judge and the administration on this particular issue. By the way, this sort of ruling happens more than you think. And until I started to really cover the Supreme Court, I didn't realize that, where, the Supreme Court, the highest court in the land that's ruling on the Constitution, doesn't always do that. Instead, they may say, okay, interesting case, but it came to us in the wrong way. It has to come to us in a different way. It has to take a different route. And then that will sort of change the nature of the case, at least temporarily. It doesn't mean the issues go away. It just delays the case from potentially reaching the Supreme Court again. Separately, what's interesting about this ruling, by the way, the justices all agreed that if a person is up for deportation or up for removal, if they, for example, are an alleged Venezuelan gang member and the United States wants to remove them to El Salvador, all the justices agreed that a person should have the opportunity to challenge their removal. They should have a heads up on it and they should have the ability to challenge it. And that could potentially slow down or restrict some of the administration's actions, at least right now. But for the defendants representing these individuals that are challenging the use of this law, they're sort of going to have to start over in Texas. But we do expect to see this legal argument again. So it's not going away. Short term, it's a win for the administration. Long term, to be determined. So a few of your big headlines for this week. We got a lot of news moving and developing, and I'll make sure to keep you updated on all the important facets of these stories. In the meantime, don't forget the amazing things and the amazing people that we also get to talk about on a regular basis. And thank you for your support of quick, concise, nonpartisan, smarter news. Have a great day.